Kia ora, everyone. My name is Deborah Small. And yes, my original title that I was assigned was What Does It Take to Take on a Racist Criminal Justice System? But as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about here, and the first day that my first full day in New Zealand, we went to Arohata Prison outside of Wellington. And I had been there before, 10 years ago, during my first trip to New Zealand, and spent a fair amount of time with the women both times. And the thing for me that was both encouraging and difficult was my first impression of Arohata when I came the first time was how different imprisonment here is from the States. Women weren't wearing orange jumpsuits. They weren't shackled all the time. They weren't living in terrible, smelly, small cells. They weren't dehumanized in the way that they are in the States. And I was like, wow, this is really good. You know, this is a much more humane way than the US. But what was also true then was that the majority of the women that I met there were primarily Maori, 2/3. More than 80% were there for drug or alcohol-related problems. The majority of them were mothers, and the majority of them were in grief over their separation from their families. And that was true 10 years ago, and it was true 1 week ago. And so that part was really discouraging, because in that respect, not that much had changed. And what was particularly discouraging was how many women reported that they had never had the opportunity to have meaningful drug treatment until they arrived in prison. And so it had me thinking, you know, when Ross said he wanted me to speak to the addiction conference, that, you know, we talk a lot about addiction to drugs, but we don't talk about our most harmful addiction, which is our addiction to punishment. And we rarely think about what the cost of that addiction is over centuries, for families, for countries. So I decided to change the name of my talk and really focus on how drug prohibition and race has led us to have an addiction to punishment. So I want to start by discussing the role of addiction in developing the enterprise that came to be known as the British Empire and its most successful spin-off, the United States. The empire grew and expanded by the intentional exploitation and commercialization of addiction to sugar, tobacco, alcohol. These substances have become embedded in our culture and continue to provide a handsome source of profit. Now, you know, the thing about that I find really interesting is that most people don't know or don't remember that prior to colonization, there was not an international market for sugar. Sugar was something that was reserved for the rich. It was one of the ways that people demonstrated their wealth, was how much sugar they had stored away in their homes. But everyday people, working people, did not have access to sugar, which is one reason they tended to drink a lot of beer at the time. But what colonization made possible was the mass development, the mass cultivation, and mass distribution of sugar. And colonization of India gave them something to put the sugar in, tea. So I think it's important for us when we think about addiction to remember the fact that we live in countries that built their wealth on promoting addiction for profit. And that for people of color like myself, whose ancestors were enslaved, and for people of Maori descent, whose ancestors had their land stolen from you and your culture oppressed, that for us, you know, this addiction had people go beyond their unhealthy relationship to plants to begin to develop an unhealthy relationship to people that allowed them to believe that it was okay to exploit them and dehumanize them in pursuit of profit. Europeans created a racist ideology to justify the slave trade and colonial conquest. Africans and indigenous people of the New World were cast as subhuman, uncivilized, inferior to Europeans in every way. And since they were not one of us, they could be bought, sold, and economically exploited. The development and the continuing legacy of modern racism is inextricably linked to this history of slave trade and colonialism. This picture, to me, sums up the story of early U.S. capitalism. Not only was the wealth of the nation derived literally and figuratively from exploiting the labor and resources of African people, but you got to understand that one of the reasons this picture was taken, because for those people, this woman was nothing more than a cow, someone to be milked in service of their own children. One of the things about slavery and colonization is that it relied on swift and harsh punishment. People were considered chattel. They had no rights. And the prevailing law permitted owners to inflict punishments for any and every offense, including resisting slavery. Wow, surprised that people would want to do that. Not working hard enough. Super surprised people wouldn't want to do that. Talking too much or using their native language, because none of us came from ancestors for whom the English was our chosen language or original language. Stealing from your owner, that's an oxymoron if I ever heard one. Murdering a white man, well, I could see why they might want to punish people for that. Or trying to run away. These are the kinds of methods that were used to punish our people. And for me, these images are important because while we don't do these things today, we use many of the same types of implements. And quite frankly,
even though we all think we're familiar with the routine
for me, I think it's important to think about the ways in which our incarceral systems replicate and use some of the same instruments that were used to punish people. People who were enslaved, Aboriginal people who refused to be enslaved but also refused to cooperate. And I also think it's important to remember that these punishments involve not just pain, but also humiliation. And in many cases, enslaved people, indigenous people were forced to inflict these punishments on each other. And I'm just going to play this quick video because it's harsh but true.
Of the slave trade. When you read what some of these slave owners did, it really does make your stomach heave. Here are 3 accounts of punishments meted out by Thistlewood in 3 months in 1756. Darby catched eating canes, had him well flogged and pickled, then made Hector shit in his mouth. Rubbed Hazat with molasses and exposed him naked to the flies all day and to the mosquitoes all night. Flogged Punch well, and then washed and rubbed in salt pickle, lime juice and bird pepper. Made Negro Joe piss in his eyes and mouth. Even though...
So when we wonder why there's so much violence in the communities of people who've been oppressed and colonized, it's important to remember the ways in which they were instructed to engage in violence and humiliation against each other, and learn from the people who were supposed to be their inferiors, their superiors, to treat other people as less than human. So for African Americans, we've learned during almost 250 years of enslavement to expect harsh punishment for even minor infractions. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, the system of punishment that existed on plantations was transferred to the state. And the criminal justice system became the principal means for being able to control black people, to control their movements. I mean, some of the laws that were passed made it illegal to be more than 10 miles away from your home without a letter explaining why you were doing. These were called vagrancy laws, for which people would be picked up and convicted And instead of serving time in prison, they had this unique thing called convict labor, where you would be leased out to other white plantation owners, and you'd work off your punishment by performing labor. Not that much different from what we're doing now in the US in our prisons. I think it's important for us to have a conversation. I mean, we all have a discussion of what racism is. We know that it's the belief that one group of people is inferior to another and thereby deserving of disparate treatment. And we know what punishment is. It's the infliction of pain or suffering or a penalty on another person, supposedly in retribution for an offense. But I wanted to also talk about the word addict and where it was derived from, because we use the term a lot. But I know when I was in school, because I didn't take Latin, I didn't know where the word came from. And I was surprised to find out that it came from the Latin term addictus, which literally means to devote or surrender. For example, to surrender oneself to something habitually or obsessively. But before it became to have that definition, it was actually the term that was given to people who were enslaved as a result of conquest and given over to Roman soldiers as their booty, reward for conquest. These people were known as addicts. And eventually, a person who was a slave to anything became known as an addict. Our contemporary definition of addiction is the persistent compulsive use of a substance or involvement in activity known by the user to be physically, psychologically, economically, or socially harmful. Now, most of us, when we think about this word, we think about people's relationships to substance. We think about their relationships to drugs. If we're really being honest, we'll think about their relationships to many of the devices that we've come to incorporate into our lives, like cell phones and iPads, etc. But we rarely think about our system of punishment when we think of addiction. And yet, if you use this definition, it is involvement in activity that is known by the people who promote it to be physically, psychologically, economically, and socially harmful. So why is that? Like, why do we not have that within our frame of reference? And what does it say about the state of denial that we have about our societies, that we would focus so much resources to addiction to drugs and alcohol, but none to our addiction to punishment? This is a cute little thing that just talks about the different types of addiction that people can engage in. Food is my drug, purge is my addiction. Music, Facebook, you know. I love the one that says, this Twitter thing has gone far enough. And I think yesterday, Mr. Selman made the point that people have begun to really take seriously issues around food addiction. I know in many parts of Asia, they're taking seriously internet addiction and the way that people are developing compulsive behaviors around that. I know that as a grandparent, I've been really alarmed at my grandson's what I consider to be unhealthy relationship to sugar and unhealthy relationship to devices. And I've had to think about what are the harm reduction approaches to that. And I think that if we were willing to be honest about the broad spectrum of addictive behaviors that exist in our society, we would acknowledge that for the most part, we don't believe that punishment is the appropriate response. I know that I'm not trying to punish my grandson away from sugar. I want to teach him how to make good decisions. I don't think any of us think it's a good idea to ban the internet. But we also know that there are people amongst us who have an unhealthy relationship to devices. And many of us employ harm reduction tools for ourselves and others in our relationship to that. So I have to question, why is it that when it comes to these particular substances, that we persist in doing things that we know that don't work? So I want to play this clip that talks about the ways in which the drug
Looking to
war
find
is
out
rooted
more
in
about the
racism.
longer history of drugs in America, I found an unlikely source in Lincoln historian Richard Miller. His research put drug laws in a fascinating historical context.
Historically, anti-drug laws have always been associated with race. In the 1800s, certain kinds of drugs that are illicit today were common in this country. Cocaine was widely used, heroin. People using drugs was something that was just ordinarily accepted. Opium, for example, was used by middle-aged, successful whites, often housewives in the South. If people were addicted or abusing drugs, they were viewed sympathetically as people who had to be helped. It was seen as a public health issue rather than a crime issue. Well, one of the first changes was on the West Coast, when smoking opium was made a criminal offense. Now, why would opium smoking be illegal in California but not in Mississippi? What was going on in California that was a concern about smoking opium? Well, as it turns out, it had nothing to do with opium itself. The concern was with the people associated with smoking opium, and that was the Chinese, who had come to this country, and many of whom were in California, working hard, working for very little pay, and becoming part of the American success story. But their success was taking jobs away from white workers. So politicians got together and decided they got to find something about the Chinese for which they can be criminalized to get them out of the way. Now, of course, you can't throw people in jail simply because they're Chinese, but you can throw them in jail because they smoke opium. In the same way, we saw things going on with cocaine. Again, it was middle-aged, successful people in this country, business executives, physicians, housewives, all perfectly legal. But then around the turn of the century, cocaine began being associated with blacks. They could withstand police bullets, it was thought. They can work hard all day, all night long, and all day long again, threatening the jobs of white workers. And so laws began to be passed against cocaine. You're not arresting these people officially because they're black. You're arresting them because they've committed some sort of drug violation. Next, of course, we see the change in reputation that hemp has had. Hemp was a legitimate crop from colonial times forward, a widely appreciated commercial product. But then in the 1930s, hemp changed into something vicious and fearsome called marijuana, because at that time, marijuana smoking was being associated with Mexicans, working hard, working cheap. And once again, what was being outlawed was not being Mexican, but just some habit associated with Mexicans. These laws set up a very dangerous precedent of racial control.
It seemed that time and again, drug laws targeted any immigrant group seen as a threat to the established economic order.
I hope that this isn't the first time that you learn the history of our drug laws. But whether it is or not, I think it's worth bearing in mind that it's not an accident, the drugs that we've chosen to prohibit. And it's not an accident, the people that we chose to target for using those drugs. Those drugs were intended and are operating exactly the way they were designed to, as a system of racial control, as a system to promote domination of the dominant class, and to also cast those people, a significant segment of society, as criminals, so that you didn't have to take responsibility for the discrimination that they faced, for the lack of access to resources, because after all, they didn't deserve them. They were criminals. And I think that that struggle has been with us for a long time and continues to be. In the US, the modern war on drugs found its origins in the response of the United States to the civil rights movement, to the demand by black people to have real equality under the law, not just in rhetoric, but in fact. And when they did not receive it, people got upset. That upset, that protest, was called riots by the police and uprisings by people in the community. And what's interesting to me about this is that Lyndon Johnson, who I think was one of our better presidents in terms of promoting civil rights and the ability of government to actually be used to uplift people, was upset because the things that he did that he thought were good weren't appreciated enough. that people like Martin Luther King had the nerve to protest the involvement in Vietnam instead of staying in his lane and continuing to praise him for the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. He was upset that black people were rising up in the streets because, after all, he was the great black father who gave us the voting rights that we had been guaranteed almost 100 years before. And I say that because that particular dynamic, I think, continues to remain in many of our countries, especially the ones with histories of slavery and colonialism. The dynamic that says that when the people who've been oppressed and oppressed stand up and demand their rights, that somehow that demand is unreasonable, that somehow they're supposed to be patient until the conquerors decide that they're willing to give them back some of their rights, or keep some of the promises that they made, or share some of the resources that they exploited from them. And when people say that's not enough, they're considered to be ungrateful. And as I said to people many times, because this is my conversation about philanthropy in general, because it's generated primarily by rich people who don't pay their taxes. When someone comes and steals from you, steals your land, steals your home, steals your furniture, and then they come back a few years later and offer you a piece of furniture or a backyard or a little plot to grow some vegetables, you don't say thank you. You say, where the hell is the rest of my shit? And so I think we really need to get out of this conversation, that assumes that we're supposed to wait for justice, that we're supposed to be patient with incremental change when the damage to our people is happening daily. And it's not incremental. I think it's really important for us to understand that that's another form of racism. That's another form of maintaining white supremacy. And it's relevant to me specifically when it comes to the question about cannabis legalization. Because quite frankly, I've yet to have anyone make an argument to me in any of the places that I've been that the majority of the people who use cannabis, who buy cannabis, who sell cannabis, are the people who are being arrested for it. That's not true in the US. It's not true in New Zealand. It's not true in the UK. This notion that somehow kids are being protected by cannabis law enforcement, my question is, whose kids? Whose kids? Because every data survey that we take shows us that half of all kids experiment with cannabis at some point before they reach their age of adulthood. But not all kids are being policed for that. So who's being protected, and at whose expense? Because the reality from my point of view is that people of color are doing time for white folks who are doing crime. And so we need to have a different conversation about what reform is, about what it means to actually embrace change, and what it means to talk about doing incremental things like decriminalization. And I'm going to end with a couple of stories. One is about decriminalization in New York City. In 1973, New York passed the country's harshest drug laws. They were known as the Rockefeller drug laws. And they required sentences of 15 years to life for anyone who was convicted of possessing or selling more than 2 ounces of any of the prescribed drugs. And at the time it was passed, that list included cannabis. But you got to get, this was the height of the 70s. And there were lots of people smoking cannabis, including young white kids in college, etc. So in 1977, the legislature changed the law and they decriminalized cannabis to make it a misdemeanor offense. And the only way that you could be arrested for cannabis offense was if you were smoking it in public view or possessing it in public view. And the police went out into the community to inform all these nice white kids, like, don't worry about it. As long as you don't do these things, we're not going to arrest you. You're not going to get a record. You're going to be okay. And for the first 15 years or so of the law, arrests were very low. less than $5,000 a year, which in New York, a city of 8 million people, is a low level of arrests. But then in came Giuliani, who decided that he wanted to employ what he called broken windows policing. That said the way that you reduce crime is to go after every little petty offense and arrest those people, and somehow that's supposed to be a great crime prevention strategy. So all of a sudden, our police started focusing on marijuana possession, and arrests started going up. But you got to think, people are not stupid. So it didn't take more than a year or so of this indiscriminate arrest of people who might be smoking in the park or whatever for people to stop any kind of smoking publicly. So then the police had to find another way to still meet their quota of arrests. So they developed this policy called stop and frisk, which allowed them to stop people on the streets and empty out their pockets, sometimes even take down their pants. And if they found any marijuana on them in the course of that frisk, they charged them with having it in public view. Now, from my point of view, that's a manufactured arrest. That's not an arrest for criminal conduct. But our arrest rate went from 5,000 a year to up to 50,000 a year. And I don't think it would surprise you to know that 85% of those people charged were African American or Latino youth under the age of 25. Now, I dared every police and law enforcement and public official I met to show me any data that justified thinking that 85% of the people who were smoking and using weed in New York City were people of color. They never could, never did, didn't even try. They're like, well, they're not really going to prison for that. Well, maybe they might get in trouble for other things. Well, this way, we'll know which ones are the bad ones. And what I said to them is this. You all have a conversation that cannabis is a gateway drug. I say cannabis law enforcement is people's head start to prison, because you're bringing young people into contact with the law who would not otherwise be in contact for the law, and for behavior for which many other young people, their peers, are engaging in with impunity. So not only are you showing them, what white supremacy in action means, you're also showing them to disrespect the law, because the law is unfair, because the law is unjust, because the law doesn't even pretend to care about the consequences of its actions on people. And I say that to you because that's some of the conversation I hear going on here, that somehow decriminalization is going to make things better. But what decriminalization does is two things. Number one, it doesn't deal with the problem of supply. So you still don't have a system that lets people know about the purity of the drugs that they're buying or what even is in it, or whether or not it's being sold by people who also sell other drugs, who also engage in other kinds of things. You don't know that. Often case, that's not what's happening, at least not in the States. Our drug markets tend to be fairly separated and discrete. But the bottom line is that if you don't have a regulated market, if you don't have a legal form of supply, then you're allowing for discrimination in the form of police discretion around it. And then the second thing is that you're really reinforcing this belief that somehow it's okay to sacrifice one group of people under the umbrella of protecting another. I think that, for me, that's like the essence of what's wrong with our criminal justice system, because we've become accustomed to think that it's okay to have one group of people, usually people who've already suffered lots of deprivation in their lives, to be further harmed because we're protecting society. And we have to begin to ask ourselves, which society are we protecting with those policies? Which children are we protecting with those practices? Whose budget are we building up? Because the other side of all of this is to ask who profits from punishment. Who's making money? In the same way that colonization and enslavement was predicated on the exploitation for profit of human misery for profit, Our prison industrial complex has people profiting from the human misery of others. And I want to say this last thing, and then I think I'm going to stop so we can have a conversation. In the States, there's a big movement now for to end mass incarceration. And, you know, you hear the numbers, 2 million people behind bars, and that's true. It doesn't include the additional 5 million people who are also under justice supervision on any given day. And I think that that's a good thing, long time coming. But it kind of misses the point. Number one, the issue is not just incarceration, it's criminalization. We have mass criminalization in our country. And by just focusing on reducing prison beds, it doesn't have you really think about all the other ways in which the system hurts people. And so you can call almost anything reform if it results in less people behind bars, even if it means that they're now wearing electronic monitors that they have to pay for. And as one of my fellow colleagues from Colorado, by the way, said to me the other day, she's like, what's the value of getting people out of prison if they die 2 months later homeless under a bridge from an overdose? So I think we really have to think about what are the comprehensive approaches that we can have that are really going to address the real pain and suffering in our community. And then the last thing that I want to say is about reparations. Because oftentimes, countries are willing to acknowledge that they've made a mistake. They had bad public policy. They did things that hurt people. And so they'll change those policies and pat themselves on the back for making that change, but make no effort to repair the harm that was done to the people who were hurt. So the British love talking about how they ended the slave trade, you know, and stopped the human importation back in 18, whatever it was. But what they don't say is that they compensated every British person for the loss of their slave property, but they did not compensate any of the people who were slaves. Similarly, in the US, we had a civil war. Black people were freed legally, at least temporarily. They were given certain constitutional rights, but we've never gotten an apology. We've never gotten any reparations. We've never gotten any kind of formal acknowledgement from the government about the centuries of harm that they did to our people and the ways in which those harms are continuing to play out in our communities every year. So I think it's important when you think about reform, particularly in the area of cannabis, which is the most heavily policed drug in every country that has drug prohibition, and where the harms are always directed at marginalized people. What does reparations look like? Reparations doesn't just look like only expunging the records, which is a good start, but it also means like reinvesting in the communities that were harmed, paying people, like, yeah, real money, you know, like they do to businesses who lose money and other people that were harmed. Why is it always a problem to pay real money when you're talking about people of color? It's not like white people don't squander money. Why shouldn't we have the right to? You know, and I'm not saying that we would, but I'm just saying there's like these conversations that continue year after year, generation after generation, that are predicated on a falsehood. Falsehood. Last thing, I promise. People who oppose reform say it's on the burden of the people who are proposing it to argue why the change is good. Personally, I'm like, seriously? Like, why do you have to justify getting rid of bad policies? That's like asking black people to continue to argue why slavery should have ended, or why women should have equal rights, or why we should stop criminalizing our LGBTQ community. Like, why is the burden on those people to say why these things should be changed when they never should have been done in the first place? When the policies are harmful, and obviously so. I say the people who want to keep cannabis prohibition need to convince us why we should. They need to explain why it's okay to maintain a status quo that continues to keep people impoverished and marginalized and provides no health benefits, none. I thought the lecture that we heard yesterday from Professor Hinamura was like unbelievably persuasive, because if you actually care about health and harm, why would you keep this? So I don't want us to engage in a whole lot of arguing with people who are talking out their ass. Let's speak truth to power and put the burden on them to justify why they continue to want us to remain addicted to punishment. Thank you. Sure. Okay. I didn't know we had time. I wasn't sure if we had time. I wasn't sure we had time. Oh, okay, good. Okay, good.
Good. We've got time for some questions. So anyone got people with their little boxes going around waiting for people to stick their hand up? Any questions? Anything you want to say? Any questions? Or stunned silence? Oh, yeah, there's one.
Kia ora. I had been thinking about redress in regards to the referendum coming up around cannabis, and what has been your experience? I know it sounded like it's been not much redress happening whatsoever, but what has been your experience around when cannabis has been made legal? Has there been redress to those who have been incarcerated or punished in some way?
So in both DC and California, both of those reform initiatives included a restorative justice component. So not only did they require that the records be expunged, but they also required that some of the tax revenue had to be reinvested in communities. And both of those things are great things. If we had to do it over again, I think we'd do some things differently. One of the things about record expungement was that it was written in a way that required the defendant to appeal, to apply, to get their record expunged. But then we realized early on, because a couple of county prosecutors decided that instead of going through that process, that they would just expunge the records themselves, that the state actually has a database of these convictions. And so the burden should be on them to do the expungement. We included in the law that that prior conviction of a drug offense could not be a barrier to employment or entering the industry, and that was a really good thing, but it hasn't been enough. Because the thing about regulation, and Professor Kylie Quinn said this last week, that regulation means more rules, not less. And so while we got rid of those convictions as a barrier, there are so many other barriers that come with regulation that have to do with licensing requirements and capital requirements, et cetera. And so I think, if we had anticipated some of those things, we would have required the law to create ways for minority people, formerly incarcerated people, to actually have access to capital. We would have written the licensing requirements in ways that supported them. Now, I have to say, I live in the city. I live near Berkeley, and Berkeley is not the most progressive city, but it is pretty progressive. And one of the ways that they tried to ensure equity in the cannabis business locally was by including in the licensing requirements that they had to hire a certain percentage of people from affected communities, that they had to enter into real partnerships with people, that they had to demonstrate that their business was actually going to be involved in activities that were reparative and restorative. So it wasn't just enough for you to have the money and the know-how, et cetera. You also had to show that your business was going to achieve some of the social justice aims of the legislation. But I would go further here, quite frankly. I think that one of the opportunities that New Zealand has that the U.S. doesn't have, because in addition to being addicted to punishment, we're also addicted to capitalism. So we weren't really willing to consider having non-capitalist business models. But I think that if you want to make sure that the market isn't dominated by big alcohol, big tobacco, big money in general, that you want to start out in the outset by prescribing certain types of business models. And you don't have to say that it can only be X, Y, or Z. You can say it can't be P. It can't be for profit, okay? It can't be predatory. And that still leaves you lots of other options to choose from in terms of models that would support Maori communities, that would support rural communities. But you don't want it to be based on the prevailing capitalist model, I think. And I think that's something in particular for Maori communities to think about going in. Because if you don't have it in the law in the beginning, it's going to be a whole lot harder to get it in later on.
Thank you very much for that. And I guess my follow-up question was around, was there a rollout of education and awareness raising around the communities in which it was lifted, and what did that look like?
So I'm glad you asked that, because I actually think that's a really essential component of any system of drug regulation and control, is that you have to have consumer education. Now, one of the things about California was that we had already had 20 years of medical marijuana. And so to some degree, our consumer population was somewhat more educated than people who'd never had medical or, adult use marijuana. But I think Colorado is an example of what happens in a state that doesn't affirmatively include harm reduction education in their rollout of their cannabis control program. And I'll just say, quite frankly, it troubles me that Colorado is constantly lifted up as the example and the model that people want to look to for how you should do this. Because, two things I know about it. Number one, many of the people who designed the implementation of the program didn't want it to succeed. I'm not saying that for everyone, but for a substantial number of people. And one of the goals that the implementation had, the philosophy that drove many of the decisions in Colorado, was a belief that the majority of the people who had been getting medical marijuana were not legitimate patients. And so they viewed the legalization as a way to get all those people out of the medicinal marijuana pool into the quote-unquote recreational pool, and therefore delegitimize the value of their use as being medicinal. Now, I don't think I have to argue to you the many ways in which cannabis can be medicinal. But I also think one of the things that points to me is the importance of who you choose to be your implementers, who you choose to be your legislators, who you choose to be the people who are making the decisions about how you're going to monitor, what regulation actually looks like in fact, and what are the underlying beliefs that they have going into it. I'm not going to say that the California model is best. I don't know that we have a best model in the U.S. because we're still operating in a frame where we have federal cannabis prohibition, and so with the complications of when you have state law that's different from federal law creates all kinds of difficulties, not the least which are financial, because most of our cannabis businesses can't do regular banking because our federal government views them as continuing ongoing criminal enterprises. And so you have these businesses going around with large bags of cash, that they have to use to pay their bills and things because they can't do regular banking. And so, there are a lot of practical aspects around both what you put in the legislation and what you put in the rules and regulations that I think are important. I definitely think consumer education is important because I've heard a lot of people say, well, let's just limit the THC content. But I think the problem of doing that is that you're then penalizing medical users, particularly people who are using it for pain management, by forcing them to have to consume more and spend more in order to get their relief. But one of the things I know, and I think those of you, who do research around drugs know that this is true, that most people, when given the opportunity, use drugs moderately and as healthily as possible. Now, there's always a subset of people for whom that's not going to be true. But for the majority of the people, that is true. And so one of the points of doing good drug education is to educate people about what safe consumption looks like. And I would also advise that you build in a research component to look at things like drug interactions, because it's quiet as it's kept. Your largest growing market after regulation is not going to be young people. It's going to be older people. Seriously, we've seen a huge growth in the senior market in the U.S. as people begin to recognize the ways in which cannabis can actually improve their lives. And I think that's a good thing. But the thing that we don't know enough about is how does cannabis interact with things like medicines people take for high blood pressure or diabetes or, the many other sort of daily kind of medications that people take as they're getting older. And I think that's something for the health community to care about. We care a lot about whether or not they smoke too much, but we don't care that much about what else is going into their body and how that interacts with the drugs that they're taking. And I'll leave with that.